the things that sometimes we do, like moving, changing jobs, adding to our families, even the happy things, adding to our families, those are stressful transition points. And regardless of whether those transitions are quote unquote negative or positive, there can be grief around them. And what I mean by that is, even if it's something positive, like adding to your family, there may still be a little bit of a sense of grief of the things that you are losing.
Welcome back to the You Need a Counselor podcast. This is a show presented by Heart and Solutions Counseling Agency. We release new episodes every Sunday at 5 p.m. Central and encourage you to batch up that laundry, put away the dishes, plan for the week ahead, or do any other task that might seem daunting while you give our show a listen. You might just be encouraged to call your therapist, connect with this week's guest, or seek out those services you've been considering for a while but haven't made the commitment to yet. If you are in the state of Iowa and are in need of mental or behavioral health counseling, give us a call at 1-800-531-4236. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome back to the You Need a Counselor podcast. My name is Dr. Julie Johnson. I'm the founder and president here at Heart and Solutions Mental Health Counseling here in Iowa.
And I'm Chrissa Hunt. I am our vice president in charge of our behavioral health department. And this is our podcast, You Need a Counselor. So we are a podcast designed for people curious about counseling, but have barriers keeping them from experiencing the benefits of counseling. Our mission is to share stories about counseling, good, bad, and indifferent, and spread the message that everyone can benefit from mental health and behavioral health counseling services.
So our guest today joins us from our Mason City, Iowa office location. Mason City, if you are somewhere else in the country and you don't know anything about Iowa, Mason City is famous for being the last place that, it's right next to the last place that Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper all performed before they were unfortunately killed in a plane accident. And so there is this place called the Surf Ballroom, and it is the biggest party around. It is just awesome, and people come from all over the country to go to it. So if you're not familiar with Iowa at all, and you certainly don't know where Mason City, Iowa is, it is right next to Clear Lake, where tons of people go. It's a beach community there in Clear Lake, and Mason City has lot of industry, just a lot of really, really cool things. Music Man Square out there in Mason City, tons and tons of really nice walking trails and public gardens. It's just a beautiful, beautiful place. So our guest today is a social worker and a therapist in our Mason City office here at Heart and Solutions. She has a background in mental health. She's been in this field for 10 years and recently got her master's in social work. And she also has a background and a certificate in aging and in longevity studies. So that's a very, very interesting topic. I'm very interested in learning more about today. Welcome, Maggie Alton, to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you. I was actually going to mention Music Man when I was hearing you talk. I'm like, don't forget Music Man. I'm a musical kid. So for me, learning as a kid, learning that Meredith Willson was from Mason City and that's where it was based. And that was like the first musical I was ever introduced to. So yeah, some of the architecture too is beautiful downtown. They've got a lot of like Art Deco stuff. Just throwing that out there for anybody who's interested. So.
Absolutely. A very, very historical place, and a place that's very, very rich in the arts. So absolutely a great place to visit. And a lot of people have very personal connection and ties with the Music Man. I think that's just one of those that, man, if it gets you, it gets you, you know?
It does.
Love that. Wonderful. So now tell us about aging and longevity studies and the certification.
So how do I start that? So I have always enjoyed working with the older population. My first job at 16 years old was as a CNA. And throughout my other positions, like through college, and then when I got my bachelor's, and then for that 10 years, kind of in between my bachelor's and my master's, when I was working in the mental health field, even if what I was doing didn't necessarily have to do with the older adult population, you always ran into specific barriers or specific concerns for that population that weren't being addressed. And there's a lot of different factors in that, but it really piqued my interest. And so when I eventually made the decision that I was going to go back and get my master's, I was trying to decide, particularly between trauma informed and aging and longevity studies. And those seem like such polar opposites, but trauma informed just because I knew that if I was going to be doing therapy, that was going to be kind of the way I wanted to go. But I wanted to do that aging and longevity studies piece because global aging, I mean, we're already seeing some of the effects of it now, but global aging is going to be something that affects my whole career. I mean, the entirety of my career is going to be dealing with that transition in the mental health field of people getting older, retiring, and basically aging out of that boomer generation while we haven't put in enough people to like replace, which I know we're starting to see already, like in the news and regarding the economy and all that sort of thing. But in addition to that, there is a lot, and still is a lot, of stigma around mental health in that particular demographic. And so I kind of went that way, in that, one, it's not a demographic that a lot of people pick. And so that it tends to be that there really is a lot of underserved people. And for me, kind of, I've always been one of those people that has like a 5-year plan. And so in my brain, I was thinking, if I get this certification and then go forward after my master's and get like an LISW, then I can actually bill Medicare and see those people for therapy and help older individuals that are very much underserved with that trauma and loss and life transition. And at that older stage of life, there is a lot of that going on, just by virtue of the stage you're in. So that's kind of why I went that way. I've always been drawn towards that demographic, but for me, it just sort of made sense, in that even though it's a bit more of an indirect path to what I want to do eventually, well, kind of and kind of not. Like, it's indirect in that I didn't get the trauma informed piece right off the bat, but it's not in that I feel much better prepared. And it's already come up several times. I have several clients who, and it makes sense that they're like, oh, you won't know what I'm talking about. You haven't reached that stage of life yet. You don't know. And I honestly do think that it's through that certification and my understanding of global aging and global, those global aging dynamics and lifespan development and all of those things that I've been able to be a good fit for that client, even though they're right. There are things that I haven't come up against yet, just because I'm not at that stage.
What are some of those barriers that you think like aging adults have that aren't addressed in like the mental health field?
Okay. Oh, there's so many. So one is definitely stigma, just because even though there has been a lot of work on educating, younger people, bringing mental health into schools and coping skills into schools, and even into like workplace employment, and all of these sorts of things. There is still a lot more stigma in that older generation, and not just stigma, but I would say just a lack of awareness. And I feel like that's where a lot of it comes from, is just that sense of, and not to be stereotypical, but back in like the 50s, 60s, even somewhat in the 70s, if you were having issues, you were essentially, you dealt with it on your own, unless it was something really big, like a psychosis or something that really couldn't be swept under the rug. And a lot of in ways we were taught to sweep it under the rug. And there is still a lot of that mentality that is still sitting for that older generation, just because they weren't exposed to the education and the awareness about mental health that so many other subsequent generations have been. So there's that aspect. One of the biggest issues is monetary, not just in terms of insurance. And I could I have a little bit of a bee in my bonnet about Medicare and the fact that they are very strict on what type of license and how many licenses and all of these sorts of things. Because while I understand, and yes, we want to be providing care and, good quality care for these people, like by being that restrictive, the powers that be who run Medicare have made it to where people who are on Medicare can't find providers to take it. And so they just don't get that care, or they have to pay it out of pocket. And paying it out of pocket is not a great option either if you're already, retired, living on Social Security or any sort of pension. And then part of the issue is accessibility. Now, I will say that in a lot of ways, telehealth has helped that. And that is kind of one of those silver linings, I'll call it maybe, of COVID, is that after COVID, because telehealth took such a big, it got such a big uptick when everything was closed down. Since then, telehealth stayed open. And so that is at least an option for people now, but there are still some misconceptions about telehealth, how, like how good, quote unquote, is it compared to in-person therapy, issues related to accessibility in terms of like internet also. To be fair, the government did have some programs going for like a tablet, a phone, internet subsidies for US citizens who are low income, but I forget if that stops the end of this month or the beginning of next month, that program ends. So then you lose accessibility that way. But no, money is a big part of it, because regardless, we live in a society where, money talks, money pays, and you have to have a way to pay for it. And so when you don't have insurance or other community resources or supports that are in that space to help, then there you sit. Transportation before, and it kind of goes with telehealth. I mean, telehealth can definitely help with that transportation piece, but there are some people who do prefer in person, or it's a better fit to be in person, and then you have to figure out how to get there. And again, there might be some programs available for transportation to and from appointments through Medicaid and Medicare, but otherwise, especially in Iowa and in a rural state, there really isn't much in terms of, an actual city bus that runs at convenient times, or, those sorts of things that can help. And then specifically when you get into rural areas too, then you run into the issue of you're not even in the same city as where you need to be. You could, you need somebody to take you 30 minutes away, and there isn't that kind of service. So, but yeah, so money, accessibility, I feel like are two of the biggest things. And then I would say probably that stigma or that awareness piece is still pretty big in that particular population. But I feel like even that, and I don't know if it's just the globalization and technology in general, or if COVID again kind of tore down some of those walls, but I feel like even that stigma and that awareness is less of a barrier now than it was even, say, 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, Medicare is definitely a challenge as a billing agency.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting to me during 2020 and 2021 when the insurance companies were all saying, okay, we're going to create rules around telehealth. We're going to create requirements around what's allowed and what's not, what's payable and what's not. And Medicaid was now we work with a lot of children that have Medicaid. Medicaid was by far the most open, the most flexible with their requirements, followed by private insurance, and way, way down the road was Medicare. And I remember thinking, this tends to be the case with Medicare, but oh my goodness, in the situation that we were in the pandemic, clients with Medicare were the ones who needed it the
Mhm.
most. They needed those flexibilities and that accessibility the most. And they were the last ones to allow telehealth. They were the first ones to pull telehealth that could be done just by phone.
Mhm.
They were the first to pull to set requirements on that and be very strict on those requirements. And so it is extremely challenging for those with Medicare to be able to access those services. The other piece that Maggie's talking about with provider types is that up until just recently, within the last 10 months, licensed mental health counselors were not allowed to service Medicare clients. And so if you were a Medicare client, you had Medicare as your coverage, you were only allowed to see, or you were only going to be covered to see licensed independent social workers. Now, there are 8 different types of therapists that a person could potentially see. Licensed independent social worker is one of them. But there are temporarily licensed mental health counselors. There are fully licensed mental health counselors. There are marriage and family therapists and temporarily licensed marriage and family therapists. And there are social workers and independent social workers. And so social workers with a master's degree are not able to see Medicare clients unless they have that independent license, unless they have had that supervision for 2 years post graduation. And up until the last 10 months, even licensed, independently licensed mental health counselors were not able to see and service clients that have Medicare. And there was this change goes back to, gosh, when did we start seeing it? It was maybe 2018. The licensure board for mental health counselors announced we're making some changes over the next 3 years. We're going to require that temporarily licensed counselors do testing at the end of their supervision. We're going to require that they do the national test. And uh, it kind of threw the licensed mental health counseling community into a tailspin. But what they were doing, and what I continued to say the entire time, was it's for a good purpose. The reason they're making all of these regulation changes on the licensed mental health counselor side is so that it fits with the social work side, and so that we would be able to help clients that have Medicare. And so it's been a long time coming. It literally just passed within the last 10 months or so here. Huge, huge change. But what that means is that now 2 out of 8 types of therapists, right, can help. And so we've got a ways to go, I think, for Medicare service. But absolutely, those strides have at least opened up a little that much more. So that's been cool to see in the state here.
Yeah, no, I agree that 2 is still definitely better. Having more is definitely better. And that's unfortunately one of the things that we see in Iowa, and this goes back to that global aging sort of aging dynamic sort of thing, is that we as a whole are considered a older rural state. We are mostly rural. Most of our people live in those non-populated areas. And most of the people who live in those non-populated areas are the older generations. Most of the quote unquote young people in our state are the ones who live in cities, which makes some sense when you look at all the demographics and you need access to childcare and education, all of these things while you're raising families and whatnot. But what that has created is it has created a system within our state where the issues with accessibility just kind of cause this feedback loop, because part of the problem with having only 2 of the 8 types of counselors who can take Medicare is then even if you do have people who do want the help, they end up on waiting lists for forever because only so many providers take Medicare and you can only take so many people at a time. So it just, like I said, then it turns into this feedback loop. So
Yeah, definitely. So I heard you mention that your first job then was as a CNA. What kind of led from like that healthcare field to like wanting to work in the mental health field then?
it's so funny because everyone says I'm a hypocrite, and I kind of am. I when I was at that stage in life, I was really thinking nursing really hard. And I wasn't sure if I could get past the needles. And what it automatically, or not automatically, what it ultimately came down to for me was, did I think in a rural area, because I always knew I was not going to live in a big city. I always knew, even if it wasn't Iowa, it was going to be Nebraska, South Dakota, Minnesota. I'm living in the rural area. I'm a rural kid. That's where I'm comfortable. And so I knew ultimately that if that was the case, it could be that I would need to take blood or give a shot or something to a little kid, to like a baby. And I didn't think I could do that. And so the part where people think I'm a hypocrite is like the fact that I can't do needles is essentially why I didn't become a nurse, even though I've got like 8 tattoos. So that's that problem. But and I say, and continue to want more. Like, I have no shame in the fact that I am a tattoo junkie, but that is ultimately why I didn't do nursing. And yeah, I was a CNA, and then I was a cook in a nursing home, and then like, I did like some of the cashier and deli work, but no, most of my work experience has been in some level of human services, whether it's the healthcare or the mental health side. So
You had mentioned that there are times where age really does create some distance sometimes between people, or sense of distance between people. There can sometimes be this sense of, well, you haven't, you haven't gone through that phase of life yet, or you haven't experienced this or that yet. And especially with counseling, I mean, I remember I as a counselor, I always worked with children, and I didn't have any children. And so, but I was working with parents all the time. And so I remember that so clearly, that it was very frequently, right, that this would come up for clients of, but you don't know what it's like, right? And so when you've got clients who are aging adults, and they're going through some of those grieving processes, right? Like having their children leave the home and live far away, right? Or the isolation that can come with that, or losing some of those freedoms, whether it's because of physical challenges, where, okay, now I'm not as comfortable riding my golf cart around town, right? I don't feel comfortable going out on the boat anymore, right? So some of those freedoms that and those kind of lifelong habits, traditions that can kind of get whittled down due to physical ailments, there's a lot of grief that goes into that. And how do you work with your clients that may have that sense of, is this therapist going to understand what I'm going through?
so I think you actually just kind of hit the nail on the head. I think the first thing that I sort of acknowledge that maybe especially I was going to say especially older adults, but maybe not, because I work with the gamut. I think my oldest client currently is 70 years old, and my youngest currently, as part of a family therapy situation, is 5. So I have all across. Um, and I was going to say, like, originally older adults, but no, even younger kids, same thing. So, um, but ultimately, when I first approach any client, it's with validation, because so often, and not just validation, but also education and that awareness piece. So often when I first have people come into my office for whatever it is, whether it is a life transition or depression or anxiety or whatever, um, there is so often this sense of, I shouldn't be feeling like this. I should be doing better than this. I should, this shouldn't be bothering me this much, that kind of thing. And so meeting them one with validation, it's totally valid to feel overwhelmed or anxious or depressed, even on those life transitions that are quote unquote normal. Like, you know, the things that sometimes we do, like moving, changing jobs, you know, adding to our families, even the happy things, adding to our families, those are stressful transition points. And regardless of whether those transitions are quote unquote negative or positive, there can be grief around them. And what I mean by that is, even if it's something positive, like adding to your family, there may still be a little bit of a sense of grief of the things that you are losing. Because in gaining that family member, you are losing the family you had. You are changing all of these routines. You are, you know, everything shifting. And it's okay to grieve that and miss that, and sometimes kind of wish we had that simplicity or, you know, whatever. And on top of meeting with validation and that education, I feel like meeting them with that knowledge that grief is part of our life process in ways that we don't always acknowledge. Because I think that especially when you're dealing with some sort of loss or you know, loss of bodily autonomy, anything like that, there is that sense of grief, and we don't always acknowledge it that way. We always are just like, this is just the way it is, so I should be fine with it. But that's not the way it works. I mean, it is totally valid to grieve the fact that, you know, you're no longer able to do this, or that, you know, things look different now. Um, and I feel like just being able to do that, to provide that validation, to meet them with that knowledge and that acceptance of the fact that grief is totally legitimate in those circumstances. And then being able to provide education, I feel like, is that third kind of really important piece. Because again, I feel like a lot of people come to me and they're afraid I won't understand or won't be able to empathize with them because I've never gone through that thing, whatever it is that they're going through. But at the same time, and I don't mean to like intellectualize their pain or whatnot, but by me being able to provide some education on like how trauma responses work, or how the grief process works, or, you know, any of those sorts of things, it can help provide them context in a way that they maybe didn't have before. Because just because they're afraid I may not get it doesn't mean that they necessarily understand what's going on either. And so me being able to provide that education helps give them kind of those guideposts. And I feel like, even though that doesn't mean that I do officially know how they feel, because I mean, they are right in that when somebody goes through a situation like that, how they feel, how they react is completely individualistic. I'm never going to completely and totally 100% be able to stand in their shoes, but by giving them guideposts, by having the information I do have and being able to show up with that validation and that acceptance, it is enough of an understanding for them to be able to process and go forward. I feel like it's enough to show them that it is a safe place, and that even if I don't 100% understand, I'm going to sit there in the mud with you while we process through it.
Yeah, definitely. And so you mentioned you see clients from 5 all the way up till 70. Can you talk about like the difference in how you approach those clients based on their age, and like how sessions might look different?
I say, I'll be honest, like doing therapy with children scared me, which is funny because I mean, I'm a parent. I've been a parent for long before since I was a therapist, and I just wasn't sure if I wanted to do child therapy. And part of that was my own misconceptions. So, without getting into, you know, too much detail or anything, when I was a kid, I had to go to therapy. And I remember being put in a room with this lady that I really didn't like, and I mean, it was like out of a movie, like it's Bueller, like the monotone asking me questions. And I remember leaving, and one time, and I would have been 14 about this time, you know, I remember leaving a session and being like, this is a complete waste. Why am I here? She's not listening to me. Like, I'm bored out of my mind, you know, all of this stuff. And so I think that's kind of why I didn't want to do child therapy, because I didn't want to like inflict that upon children. But then when I did finally get into my master's, and I say finally because there was almost a decade or right at a decade between my bachelor's and my master's. When I went back, I found out that the approach to child therapy, and thank goodness for this, is very much different now. And so, with children, uh, it's a lot more active, right? It's a lot more playing games, doing drawing or arts, crafts, that kind of thing. Sometimes like, it really is active. There are kids who are like, doing jumping jacks or vestibular movements in while they're talking to me in session. And it's so funny because you can kind of tell, or I feel like maybe sometimes I can kind of tell those parents who also had those similar situations to me, where they have this thought in their brain because they'll come in and they're like, okay, sit down, you got to talk to her, and like, no, and then I'm like, no, get up, go play, grab the Legos, whatever. So kids are very much more active, much more creative, um, much more like over the top and dramatic, and kind of almost like theater. Almost, I was in individual speech at one time in college, and that's kind of what reminds me of is like big movements, big words, big actions to keep them engaged. And then you hit that kind of preteen age, and there's maybe some of that. At that point, it gets a little bit more individualistic, just depending on the kid and what their preferences are. Um, but yeah, and then teenagers, again, they're in that more independent stage, but they're still working on like social skills, communication skills. Peers are a big thing at that point. For me, one of the biggest things I do across the lifespan is keep in mind lifespan development and like where they're at, especially for kids. And we'll go further in this in a second. But for kids, with Erickson, we have quite a few stages of development. It makes sense. And kids, as they go through those different stages of development, it's like their brain recategorizes whatever was going on. So like if there was a trauma or if there is a transition that's happening, like in the middle of them reaching a new developmental stage, then it's like their brain has to reorganize. And so it's a lot of processing things, I feel like, from different angles about the same situation at that, when you're pretty much all the way from 5 up to like 18 to some degree. And then and then again, adults, it is more like that kind of traditional, you sit and you talk, but even that with adults, I feel like it's less, I don't know, it feels less regimented than it used to. It feels less formal, maybe, for lack of a better term. Like, I have adults who come in and mess with fidgets or will color while they're talking to me or will do diamond art or whatever. And that's all totally fine. Coping skills. I invite coping skills. This is good. But like I said, it's definitely very different than what, therapy, what a lot of people think therapy is like you go in and you sit on the couch or the chair and you just talk and you talk and you talk. And yes, there is a lot of talking and a lot of processing, but it's not, like I said, it's not nearly as formal and regimented and sterile, I guess. That's the other thing I feel like is for a very long time, and it makes sense, for a very long time, the idea in therapy was kind of that a therapist was a mirror that we were holding up to our clients, right? We basically were not supposed to necessarily put any of ourselves into it. And obviously, you still have to hold that objectivity, you have to allow that self-determination, all of those things. But as I've told, other people that I work with, and as I've told my clients, I'm not a sterile person. This is who I am in therapy. Like this is exact with the hand movements and everything. Like this is totally it. And that's sort of what I mean is therapy can be a safe, more calm, more warm space than what I think we can be. And a lot of that can have to do with like provider and provider fit. Um, and then older people I love, and I'm still sort of getting into this because when I was in grad school, it used to be that Erickson considered older people, for the most part, and when I say older, I mean like 60s and up, we're all in one life stage. That whole time was one life stage. And I believe his name is, it's either Conan or Koenig. I'll have to go back and look. But there was a researcher who took that last stage of Erickson's and said, no, that doesn't make sense. You have 40 years of life here. You're going through life transitions as you go through that. I mean, 60 to, or well, like 50 to, like 90, or when you pass, that's a long time. There's a lot of stuff that happens in there. And so that's sort of the approach I take to older people too, is that even though we have this misconception that, you get to the end of your life and you just sort of, I don't know, twiddle your thumbs and wait, I'm not sure. No, there is so much more that's going on there, and so much more life there. And at the same time, there is that potential for pain and for loss. And so it makes sense to address it from that quote unquote developmental stage where people are at. And I really do appreciate that I found that particular researcher when I was in my master's program, because I mean, he's right. It doesn't make sense that we're cramming everybody that is above, 55, 60 into one category, because it's not.
Absolutely. Well, the older I get, the younger 50 sounds to me.
Right. Well, and that's, yeah, I love that now, as because I mean, I'll say it on the radio, I don't care. I'm 35. So it for me, yeah, when I first started, because even my bachelor's is in human services counseling. So like this has literally been the track the whole time. And even thinking back to when I was in my bachelor's versus when I was in my master's, and the 10 years, and how my thoughts on like lifespan development, yeah, like that's forever from now. And now I'm like, that doesn't seem like that far.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are so many different phases between 60 and 80, 60 and 90, 60 and 100. It's incredible the third and fourth and fifth and sixth careers that people are having in their 80s, and the different family groupings that people are creating
Yeah.
in their 70s and 80s. I think it's just beautiful. I think that there was kind of this sense of, well, now that's now you're an old person, right? So now
Yeah.
you just can't do the, and there were so many limiting beliefs, I think, about what it meant to get older. And some of them positive and helpful, right? Life experience and lived experience. And then some of them very, very limiting, right? I'm too old to play. I'm too old to, and even, at my, so I'm 39. So I'll be 40 next year. And there are times where it's like, oh, I'm too old to do that, right? To play like that, right? To do these things, to get on the floor. And it's having to challenge those beliefs, just like any beliefs that we have about ourselves, right? I'm too old to do that. I'm too young to do that. I'm too female to do that, right? I'm too Asian to do that. There's so many of these beliefs that we have about ourselves. I'm too New England to do that Midwestern thing, right? Like there are so many
I'm
of
too
these.
rural to do
And
that. Like yeah, oh
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely, that we come across on a daily basis, and there are ways that we limit ourselves, and that we feel that we're being limited by other people. And so I love that you bring that holistic approach, that acceptance approach to your clients, because you're going to work with them in the same way, whether you have had that experience or not, right? So maybe I grew up with a sister, and so did Chrissa, but I have no idea about Chrissa's sister, right? Just because I had one. And so it's the same thing here. I know what it was like to be myself at 5, but I have no idea what it's like to be that client at 5. So I just love that those kind of labels that we give ourselves, or those categories that we give ourselves, they're helpful for understanding, like, hey, I'm not the only person that has a hard time with this or that, right? We can use it for normalizing. We can use it for going, okay, maybe I can find support with other people who are going through similar things, right? But it doesn't have to limit us either. I think that's the hardest thing to
Yeah.
do and to challenge. And I love that, you've got these kind of three myths that you like to challenge, and one of them being that therapy is so formal, right? And that it can be so sterile and like going to the doctor and tell me your problems and I'm gonna fix them kind of, like we're not
I
the great and
giggle.
powerful Oz.
I giggle because I really try really hard because again, those tropes about therapists.
Yeah.
And so I try really hard not to ask questions like, how does that make you
How does
feel?
that make
But
you feel?
occasionally it will come up and I will. I'll be like, okay, I'm sorry because this is the corniest therapy question ever, but because that is what I want to know. That is what but
Yeah.
yeah, it just, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Absolutely. Every time I say that, even in general conversation, I'm like, oh my
I
gosh.
try really hard to find other ways. Yeah, no, I'm that way too.
Absolutely. So another myth that you like to talk about and to help fight the stigma is that there has to be something wrong with you to go to therapy. Tell us about that.
So, I mean, the stigma for the longest time, and part of this was because of the way that the mental health system was set up anyway, was, in order to have a therapist, a psychiatrist, anybody like that, you had to be, like I said a little bit earlier, like you had to have like some sort of like deep psychosis or some really big sort of diagnosis um to need that sort of help, which is slightly ironic given that the rules for like, being being admitted to asylums and things back then were, things like you could have a cold or be tearful too much. I mean, like it literally could be anything.
Argued with your
But
husband.
um, I was gonna say, but uh yeah, there is this idea, and I, to be fair, I feel like that probably didn't help, right? That we started putting people into asylums that didn't necessarily need to be there. And so there started to become this stigma that, yeah, if you have something wrong, you're going to be sent to the loony bin or whatever. And so people stopped talking about their mental health and they started stuffing it down. And the problem with that is that we now know, I mean, and we didn't know what we didn't know back then, but now we do, that you don't get to just stuff your emotions down. When you do that, it affects you. It doesn't just go away. And not just in terms of mental health either. It can affect your physical health. It can affect all sorts of things. So it's super, super important to address your mental health. But that doesn't mean that everybody who goes to therapy necessarily has one of those big diagnoses. Especially, so something that I've been talking to with a lot of people right now is just sort of the general state of like global and political and national affairs, and how some people who, like in my day-to-day life, they're like, I feel so anxious all the time and I don't know why. Well, it's because we are literally in the middle of a global shift. Everything, the ground is shifting beneath us. It makes sense why we're anxious, but things like that. I mean, even just going to a therapist to be able to process the fact that, I have no control over any of this stuff that's going on right now, and that's making me feel really stressed out. That's legitimate. Going to a therapist to try and work on social skills or communication skills or relationship skills or problem solving skills or assertiveness skills, any of those things, also totally legitimate. And they don't necessarily mean that you have, depression or anxiety or some sort of disorder. It's just, it's one of these, I recognize that this is a thing that is affecting my own, self-esteem or self-worth or my own mental health, and I need to work on it. And so it makes sense to get a third party perspective. One of the things that therapy is great at, regardless of the reason you're going, whether there's a quote unquote big reason or you're going because you're going through a life transition, like going away to college or something, it doesn't mean that you have a disorder. It just means that you're looking for assistance, because therapy, one of the things that therapy is really great at is, as a therapist, I have all of this knowledge, all of these skills, all of these things, and I get to see you and your life from that third party perspective. I always like to use a fishbowl. Sometimes it can just be helpful to get somebody to be able to be on the outside of your fishbowl and look in and see from that perspective. Because when we are in our day-to-day life, we might have things that are bothering us or make us not feel so great or whatever, and we aren't exactly sure what's going on or what it is. And the reason for that a lot of the time is because we are so engulfed in our daily life. It's like the air we breathe is like the water in the fishbowl. We don't see it, we don't know it's there, but that is, what we're surrounded with. And by getting a therapist to come in and be like, oh, well, the pump's broken, that's why the water is dirty, let's fix this. And so it can be really helpful just to have that third person perspective. But with that being said, I mean, there is something of a spectrum, because you have those people who are coming in for maybe help with like the social skills or communication skills, or some of those more, I would say, almost preventative things, or like, in my view, in my mind, that would eventually be what therapy would be most of the time. In a perfect world, therapy would actually be building those skills from that preventative, proactive piece, not having to go back, process trauma, process all of these, the ick, and then go forward. And so you have those skills and that sort of that light end over here. You, of course, do have really serious diagnoses and symptoms and, like, heavy amounts of trauma and all of that sort of thing on this other side. And then in the middle, you do have people who, have, to some lesser or greater degree, depression or anxiety or some other situation that, they do need help with. And I feel like those are actually kind of the people sometimes that are the ones that struggled the most, because they know, right? They're aware that they don't have these skills. They're not up on this high end on that spectrum. And they aren't 100% sure. They don't have like all the education and awareness of skills and tools and symptoms and all that. And so, like, I feel like then they are afraid that they are on this bottom end of the spectrum. And I think sometimes, even though we didn't talk about this prior in the podcast, I think sometimes that is a barrier too to people going to therapy, is kind of that, once especially with therapy, once you start really working on stuff and you hit certain points, you can't go back. Once you build your awareness up to a certain point, you can't just ignore it anymore. And I do think that that can be a barrier, because there are sometimes people who know that and they're just not ready yet. And that's okay. But that whole idea of knowing, like, once I get into this, the only way out is through. And it's not going to necessarily be pleasant all the time. Like, we do our best, of course, to make it as therapeutic and productive and all of these things as possible. But unfortunately, when you're dealing with trauma or loss or anything like that, it just, part of the deal is the pain.
Yeah, definitely. And so kind of going along with that, the third myth or stigma that you had listed was that you're broken, or that stigma around even asking for help with mental health, or like going to find a therapist or start counseling. Can you kind of talk about that stigma?
I think that stigma has maybe gotten a little bit better. Again, COVID, one of those silver linings is that so many more people became open, became aware of mental health and life transitions and stress, and not even just all of those things, but I mean, some of the systems that are in place that are not helpful for people's mental health. All of that kind of came out of COVID. And I think we spoke a little bit on this in different places in the podcast, but I like the analogy, and I do not remember the actual name of the art form, so I apologize. But there is an art form in Japan where if you break a cup or a plate or a something, you don't just throw it away. You put it back together and you actually line the cracks with gold. And the idea of this art form is to show that there is beauty and perfection, that there is still usefulness even after you are no longer quote unquote perfect, all of these different things. And that is sort of the analogy that I sort of work from, and that I feel like really encapsulates sort of how I feel about that whole I'm broken analogy. And, certainly none of us go through life hoping or wishing for, not so nice things to knock us on our butt. None of us go through life, happily expecting to get a medical or mental health diagnosis that is going to change the way that we have to do things the rest of our life. But just because it's different doesn't mean it's broken. Just because something changes you doesn't mean that you are suddenly worthless or useless or, any of those things. And that's what I really like about that art form from Japan. And I feel like it really does encapsulate a lot of different aspects. Like trauma can change you, but it doesn't necessarily, have to change who you are, all of those things. Grief, same thing. Grief can be very all-encompassing for a while, but it doesn't have to be forever. And I feel like ultimately none of us like to have those things, those experiences in our lives that change us when they are those really negative, hard, painful experiences. But those experiences are what make us too. I mean, if you didn't, and not to say that that's an excuse for anybody's pain or anything, obviously it's not, but there is an element of having to go through those hard times to grow and develop, because if we weren't going through those things, we would just be staying stationary. We would, you know what I mean? We wouldn't be growing as people. We wouldn't be learning anything. We wouldn't be changing perspectives or any of that. And not to say it all comes from bad things either. I mean, those good things obviously can create those experiences too. But of course, we look for the good because they're happy. They're, they don't hurt. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a sense that the myth that says, well, if you go to counseling, there's something wrong in your life, or you're broken, or you're wrong. That myth, the challenge that we can give ourselves, the truth of that situation is that something's not going in our life the way that we want it to, whether we go to counseling or not.
Yeah.
So if something is not, if we're not functioning the way that we want to in our lives, or if things in our lives are not the way that we want them to be, that is going to happen whether we go to counseling or not. It's how we react and respond to the things that happen to us in our lives that then create the outcomes for ourselves in the future. And so the idea that, well, only people with problems go to counseling is such a myth, because no, everybody has problems. And so whether you go to counseling or not, you're still going to have the same problems you have. You're just going to have those problems and be able to manage them, be able to cope with them, be able to work with them or not. And so I love these myth busters that you have going, Maggie. These are awesome. So we've loved having you on the show. I feel like we could have filled another 3 episodes here, because we're
If you give us the right conversation, I will just talk for.
I feel like we have so much more. So we'd love to have you back on the show another day.
I am Maggie Alton, and I need a counselor.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for having me.
I'm Chrissa Hunt.
And I'm Julie Johnson, and you need a counselor.
And so do you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the You Need a Counselor podcast. We are so grateful that you're here. Now, we want to hear from you. Text us or give us a call at 515-650-3231. You can also find and connect with You Need a Counselor on Facebook and Instagram. If you've enjoyed today's show, please take a moment to like, review, or leave a comment, as all of these things help others to find and benefit from the podcast as well. If you're in the state of Iowa and interested in mental health counseling or behavioral health intervention services, give us a call at 800-531-4236. And if you're a provider seeking play therapy CEUs, you can find us on patreon.com/youneedatraining. We'll see you for the next episode, Sunday at 5.